Today's lecture is going to be super fun because we're going to get to talk about cannibalism. Yeah, I've never thought that that was that big of an issue, but anyway, if I were stranded and somebody needed to be eaten so we could stay alive, that's what we do. But anyway, so we're going to talk about the first two chapters from Major Problems. So if you go to required reading, click on Cobb's Bloom Major Problems. We're talking about the time period before 1776. So basically the time period from the connections between West Africa, Western Europe, and the Americas around 1500 for the next 270 years before the American Revolution. So you go to Unit 1, you go to Chapter 1, Old Worlds Make New Ones, and you can see there's a chapter introduction, which will kind of give you some basic information about the chapter, primary sources, and then essays, which are secondary sources. So primary sources are sources from the time period that tell us about the time period that we analyzed to consider the time period. Essays are secondary sources. These are sources written after the fact using primary sources where individuals or scholars create arguments or debating points. So the primary sources here kind of work through the engagement of the Americas, Europeans, and Western Africans. And it begins with an Iroquois description of the beginning of the world, which you can juxtapose with European descriptions of the beginning of the world from like the Bible and the book of Genesis. There's an image of Native Americans offering tithes, or basically paying homage to the Aztecs, and that document's really it's here to show that Native Americans held power over one another, in this case the Aztecs or the Mexica. Then an image of European map makers and considerations of the world. And then I want to draw us attention to this document actually from before 1500, from before Columbus, and it's titled here The Portuguese Lament Military Losses in Western Africa, 1448. So quite a bit before. And what this is the Portuguese are sailing from the edge of Western Europe into the Atlantic Ocean, and they're interacting with northern and western African peoples because they're not far away at all if you look at a map. And so these are just some of their first interactions, and what I really want to draw your attention to is how weak the Portuguese were. And so they show up along the sea coast on the shore, and they come upon a village. And the villagers, the locals, issue forth like men who showed they had a will to defend their houses. And so these are folks coming to war. And Alvaro Fernandez, the leader of the Portuguese, fights one of the villagers and defeats him. So it's kind of like, if you've watched the movie Troy, where you kind of bring out the Brad Pitt character and he fights the other guy, the Eric Bana character, and ideally the kind of one-on-one battle can kind of end it all. Or in Thor Dark World, where Thor fights that rock monster thing. Now, so he dies, and the Guineas, that's the name the Portuguese used for these Western Africans, they withdraw, they're in fear because they had lost. And the Portuguese writer writes this: but rather they returned to their ship, referring to the Portuguese, and the next day landed a little way distant from there, where they espied some of the wives of those Guineas walking. So what you have here is the Portuguese saying, oh yeah, we defeated one of them, they were in fear, but we left and we sailed away, and we sailed to a place where we saw some women, and then we landed. So this is not a powerful military expedition. So they land, and there are these wives of some of the West Africans here they are collecting shellfish, and they captured one of them, who was about 30 years of age, with a son of hers who would be about 2. So there's a 30-year-old woman with a 2-year-old son. There's a girl of 14 years old, about 14 years old. But the strength of the woman was much to be marveled at, for not one of the 3 men who came upon her but would have had a great labor in attempting to get her on the boat. So she's too strong. It's hard to get someone onto a boat. And so one of our men, seeing the delay they were making, during which it might be that some of the dwellers of the land would come upon them, well, I mean, like, hey, we're trying to kidnap this person, and it's taking time, she's making noise, we got to get out of here before the men show up. He comes up with a plan. He conceived it well to take her son from her and to carry him to the boat. So you got a 2-year-old who's now on this boat, and you're the mom. What do you do? Well, in this case, love of the child compelled the mother to follow after it, and then they sail off. So now the woman and the infant are essentially captured, but they're not captured in this kind of, hyper-militaristic way. They're captured by kidnapping and by conniving. And the story goes on. Alvaro Fernandez gets shot in the arrow with the leg, and he's sick. And but this document is here to show Western Europeans, on one hand, reaching out from Western Europe, looking to take authority over people, but not having a lot of power and having to really work out how exactly they're going to capture or enslave people. The next documents deal with the Spanish conquest of the Mexica, 1519, and then I want to draw our attention to an Englishman who trades with Indians on the Atlantic coast. Because one of the main issues here of the kind of colonial world is the colonial world defined by conquest, where Western Europeans go to West Africa and they go to the Americas and they just take over and they create colonial empires, and it's an era of conquest or power over? Or is it an era of contact? Contact is more neutral, right? Contact is more about give and take and less about power. And so in this document from 1584, an Englishman will write about trading with Native Americans along the Atlantic coast of the Americas, and writes about how they show up, they remain there for 2 days, they don't see anybody, and then a boat comes out and has some Native Americans on it. They kind of converse back and forth, and then the king's brother, so the Native American local king's brother, comes. He's accompanied by 40 or 50 men, and notice, very handsome, goodly people, in their behavior as mannerly and civilly as any of Europe. So they're not being described here as uncivilized or violent, but no, they're just as normal. They're just like other Europeans who want to trade, and they start trading back and forth. And so we presented this his brother with such things as we thought he liked, and it goes on to talk about the things we showed him. They bring him a tin dish, and that well pleased him, because if you've not seen medals before, that would be kind of an important thing. And in this case, he took the tin dish, made a hole in it, and put it around his neck like a necklace. And that it would defend him against his enemy's arrows, which is a pretty good use for a metal substance if you're not used to it. So they exchanged the tin dish for skins. They give a copper kettle for some more skins. They exchange for our hatchets. They want axes. They want knives. You can see here a pattern. They want objects forged of metal, which they really haven't had. And this king then brings his daughter, or 2 or 3 of his children. I like how it's 2 or 3 children, like the writer isn't sure how many children there were. His wife, very well favored, very bashful, which would make sense. And then he describes what the woman looks like, and they trade back and forth descriptions of the women. And then they also traded for fat bucks hares, and fish the best of the world. They get fruits, melons, walnuts, cucumbers, boards, bees. So they trade, they want food, and that makes sense if you're sailors, right? You need provisions. And so in this case, there's no kidnapping, there's no power, there's just an exchange of goods that each group really kind of wants to get. And then finally, so we've looked at some of the primary sources here. The essays. So the essays are sources from scholars. And here are two essays, and in Major Problems they offer kind of conflicting or contrasting views of the time period. So the second one by Joyce Appleby looks at how the Americas created a new world for Europeans, that before Columbus, Europeans tended to be disinterested people. They weren't curious about the world around them. They stayed in their locales. They read the same books. They stayed kind of beholden to their Catholic notions of the world, and that when reports came of the Americas, it just kind of opened up intellectual curiosity for Europeans. And so she claims that the Americas created a new world of curiosity for Europeans. Neil Salisbury has a kind of different take. He looks at what he calls this Indian's old world. And what he brings up is that he starts with scholars in history, anthropology, archaeology, and other disciplines have turned to the study of native peoples during the colonial period. And that basically a whole bunch of people want to understand how did native peoples respond to the arrival of Europeans. Well, what Neil Salisbury asks is the question of how do we know what their lives were like before Europeans came? And he says, if we look at all these different fields, indigenous or Native Americans exhibited a remarkable range of languages, economies, political systems, beliefs, and material cultures. Basically that they were super diverse and that they interacted with lots of diversity. So when Western Europeans showed up with new languages, new goods, new economies, new political structures, that wasn't new for Native Americans. That was something that they were essentially used to. And so then he goes through that the heart of these intersections was exchange, and that they exchanged goods, marriage partners, resources, labor, ideas, techniques, that there was just lots of contact and exchange really defined this era, and that wasn't new for Native Americans. And you can think of, the exchange of a marriage partner in the story of Pocahontas. And that's really what was going on there, and we'll get more into that as we in the other lectures. So that's chapter 1 of the Major Problems sources. And now we'll just kind of quickly go on to chapter 2, partly because I want to start with the essays, and just because I want to draw your attention to Rachel Herman's essay, Cannibalism and Abundance in Colonial Jamestown. I don't know if you're a fan of the show Bob's Burgers. I am. So here's the scene. You probably can't hear it, but it's where from the first episode, when one of the people outside, they're accusing Bob of cooking humans and feeding them, and he says, cannibals, and he says, that's not what I mean.
Cannibals!
That's cannibals!
Cannibals!
Cannibals! Anyway, so if you don't watch Bob's Burgers, I highly recommend it. Really great show. But we'll get back to Herman's essay in a second. The primary sources here deal with, again, these twin issues of conquest and power, or contact and exchange. But one thing I want to bring up as you go through them is the notion, another C word, confusion. And this is 1692, Salem, Massachusetts. You've probably heard about it. There's a great big witch craze, witch hunt. More than 15 English settlers will be executed as accused of being witches, and just everything's out of control. And the colonial authorities, they don't know what to do. And they turn to a slave woman, originally probably from Barbados, Tituba, who was purchased by a minister in the Caribbean and then brought to New England as a slave, they turned to her for insight. And so they ask these judges, go to Tituba and they ask, have you ever had familiarity with an evil spirit? Do you hurt the children? There were these kind of fears that the children were being hurt. Did you never see the devil? The devil came to me and bid me serve him. So, okay, it's kind of a big deal, right? The devil came to me and said, serve him. Who have you seen? Who were they? Who are the people who you've seen working with the devil? Oh, Goody Osborne and Sarah Good. They wanted me to hurt the children, but I would not. When did you see them? They said, hurt the children. It goes on. And that the devil offers her pretty things if Tituba will serve him. What does she offer? 2 rats, a red rat and a black rat, or this is what she sees. And that Goody Good, this one English woman, she hurts them in her own shape. So here's what's fascinating about this story with Tituba. Colonial authorities are going to a slave to ask about the workings of the supernatural, in this case the devil. She accuses, Tituba says she saw some of these English women working with the devil. These women get executed, but not Tituba. Okay, Tituba survives. Now, who knows why? Maybe she survives because she's a piece of property, maybe because no one can prove that she's worked with the devil. But the point is, this is just confusing. It's confusing, and not just in Salem, but it's confusing over things like, is it a good idea to be an indentured servant or not? Some think it's a good idea, like George Alsop. Some claim that it's a lot like enslavement. What type of society should be built? This Puritan leader, John Winthrop, will talk about building a model of Christian charity, a city upon a hill. Here's an indentured servant, Richard Freethorn, begging his parents to let him come home. This is a time period of massive confusion, along with a time period of conquest, along with a time period of contact. So lastly, the essays. Cannibalism and abundance in colonial Jamestown. Rachel Herman looks at this problem Europeans have, especially the British, the English. They want to send people to the colonies. They want to create colonies in the Americas. And so they describe the Americas as abundant, as full of food and resources. And then stories come back about starvation, poverty, and even, oh my gosh, cannibalism. That some of the colonial settlers have turned to digging up dead bodies and eating them. And so the English have a problem. How do you market this place like, hey, go live in the Americas. Oh, and by the way, you might starve to death and have to, someone might eat your corpse. And so Rachel Herman looks at how these early times reshape how the English think about the Americas as, ooh, maybe it's a little more dangerous, maybe it's a little more precarious than we had thought. So that's kind of the materials. Make sure to look at the rest of the primary sources, the other essays for your discussions, and good luck on the quiz.